In the winter of 1839, 3 plantation ledgers across central Mississippi recorded an identical transaction. A field hand named Joshua Fletcher purchased his freedom for $1. Within 6 months, witnesses placed him at Bellmont Plantation, living in rooms reserved for family. The white community whispered in scandalized murmurs. Joshua had not purchased his freedom. He had purchased something far more dangerous in 1840s Mississippi, the heart of his owner's daughter. For 2 years, their impossible relationship existed between secrecy and defiance. Then in March 1841, Rebecca Bellmont announced she was carrying Joshua's child. What happened next would be erased from history for over a century. The peculiar transaction. The ledger entry that would later unravel everything was written in perfect copperplate script on January 15, 1839. Joshua Fletcher, male, age 26, manumitted by purchase. Consideration paid, $1. Signed, Margaret Bellmont, proprietress. The ink was black, the penmanship flawless, the documentation complete in every technical detail. Yet the transaction itself was an obscenity, a mathematical impossibility that mocked the very system it pretended to honor. In a society where enslaved men were valued at $800 to $1,000 depending on age and skill, this transaction should have triggered immediate investigation. A field hand in his prime, educated enough to read and write, capable of managing complex plantation operations, was worth more than most families earned in a year. To manumit such a man for $1 was not generosity. It was either fraud or something more dangerous. A declaration that the rules did not apply. Yet no magistrate questioned it. No neighboring plantation owner demanded explanation. No county clerk refused to process the paperwork. The document was filed, stamped, and forgotten with a speed that suggested deliberate blindness. The silence itself was a kind of complicity, as if the entire structure of Mississippi society had agreed to look away from something they knew was wrong, but could not bring themselves to confront directly. Years later, when investigators finally examined the transaction, they would discover something peculiar about the timing. The manumission occurred exactly 3 weeks after Colonel Thomas Bellmont's death. The colonel had spent his final months preparing extensive documentation for the legal emancipation of every enslaved person on his property. Proper manumissions with full financial consideration that would have cost his estate over $40,000. But he died before executing the plan, and his widow Margaret immediately destroyed all evidence of his intentions. The $1 manumission of Joshua Fletcher was Margaret's compromise with her dead husband's wishes. She would free the one enslaved man Thomas had educated personally, the one he had treated almost as a son. But she would do it in a way that was technically legal, yet obviously fraudulent, a transaction so absurd that it could never be taken seriously. She believed this would satisfy her husband's ghost while preserving her authority over the remaining 237 enslaved people who worked Bellmont Plantation. What Margaret did not anticipate was that Joshua Fletcher would not leave, that he would remain on the plantation in a legal limbo, neither enslaved nor truly free. That her own daughter Rebecca, 17 years old and newly returned from a Charleston finishing school, would take notice of this educated man who read Shakespeare in the evenings and discussed philosophy with the confidence of someone who had never been taught that his thoughts were worthless. The ledger entry sat in the county records office for 2 years before anyone looked at it closely. By then, it was far too late to prevent what the $1 transaction had set in motion. The education of Rebecca Bellmont. Rebecca Bellmont was 17 years old when Joshua Fletcher first entered her father's study, not as property but as a man her father had begun teaching to read. She stood in the doorway, hidden by shadows, watching as Colonel Thomas Bellmont opened a volume of Wordsworth and asked Joshua to read aloud. His voice was careful, uncertain with the unfamiliar rhythms of poetry. But there was something in his concentration that captivated her. The way his finger followed the lines. the slight movement of his lips as he sounded out difficult words. The moment of understanding when a verse's meaning became clear to him. Colonel Thomas Bellmont, in the years before his death in 1838, had developed what his wife called dangerous notions about the humanity of enslaved people. He had violated every social convention by educating Joshua in secret, teaching him literature, mathematics, and philosophy in evening sessions that took place behind locked doors. The colonel never explained his motivations fully, but servants whispered that he had witnessed something during a trip to New Orleans, some cruelty so profound it had cracked his certainty about the righteousness of the system he participated in. Rebecca had always been close to her father. After her mother dismissed her questions about plantation operations as unsuitable for a young lady, Thomas had quietly begun teaching his daughter the same subjects he taught Joshua. She learned accounting by reviewing plantation ledgers. She studied biology by reading medical texts from her father's library. She developed opinions about literature and philosophy that scandalized her mother's friends when she occasionally expressed them at dinner parties. After Thomas's death in November 1838, Rebecca found herself adrift in a household that had suddenly become hostile to intellectual curiosity. Her mother, consumed with proving her competence to doubting neighbors, had no patience for a daughter who asked questions about crop rotations and debt management. The mansion felt smaller, quieter, emptied of the conversations that had once filled it. So Rebecca did what her father would have done. She continued the lessons. She invited Joshua to the study, told him that her father would have wanted his education to continue, and opened the books they had been reading. At first, their meetings were formal, separated by the careful distance that Mississippi society demanded. Joshua called her Miss Rebecca. She addressed him as Mr. Fletcher, a courtesy that would have earned her a scolding if her mother had overheard. But distance is difficult to maintain when two people are reading poetry together, when they are debating whether Hamlet's madness was real or performed, when they are working through mathematical problems that require them to lean close over the same page, their heads nearly touching as they trace equations with their fingers. Intellectual intimacy has its own momentum, and neither of them recognized the danger until it was far too late. By the spring of 1839, Rebecca had stopped calling him Mr. Fletcher, and Joshua, in private moments when no one else could hear, had begun calling her simply Rebecca. The education her father had started had transformed into something neither of them had intended, something that would destroy them both. The widow's blindness. Margaret Bellmont had inherited Bellmont Plantation upon her husband's unexpected death, a circumstance that left her both wealthy and vulnerable in a society that did not trust women to manage such enterprises. The neighboring planters had circled like wolves, offering to buy the property at insulting prices, suggesting she would be more comfortable in a smaller house in town, warning that cotton farming was too complex for feminine sensibilities. Their condescension had ignited something fierce in Margaret. She would prove them wrong. She would run Bellmont more profitably than her husband ever had. For the first 6 months after Thomas's death, Margaret barely slept. She rose before dawn to inspect the fields, reviewed accounts until midnight by lamplight, negotiated with cotton factors who tried to cheat her, and disciplined enslaved workers with a severity that shocked even the hardest overseers. She transformed herself into what the system demanded, becoming harder and colder with each passing week. There was no room for softness in a world designed to punish women who stepped outside their prescribed roles. She was so consumed with proving her competence to doubting neighbors and predatory business partners that she failed to notice what was happening in her own household. Or perhaps she chose not to notice. The human mind has a remarkable capacity for selective blindness when the truth is too complicated to confront. Margaret saw her daughter spending hours in Thomas's study. She saw Joshua Fletcher moving through the house with an ease that violated every protocol of plantation hierarchy. She saw the way Rebecca's face changed when Joshua entered a room, the way her voice softened when she spoke to him. But Margaret was managing a crisis of authority. Bellmont Plantation's cotton production had declined in the year before Thomas's death, and she needed to reverse that trend immediately or face financial ruin. Every ounce of her attention was focused on yields and markets and the endless calculations required to keep a plantation profitable. She told herself that Rebecca was simply continuing her father's eccentric educational projects. She told herself that Joshua's unusual position in the household was a remnant of Thomas's strange ideas that would gradually normalize over time. Years later, a house servant named Judith would testify about the moment Margaret's willful blindness almost broke. It was a summer morning in 1840. Judith had been carrying linens up the back stairs when she saw Margaret standing frozen in the second-floor hallway, staring at Joshua as he emerged from Rebecca's bedroom at dawn. He was still fastening his shirt. His feet were bare. The evidence of what had occurred was unmistakable. Judith watched as Margaret's face went through a series of transformations. Shock, then rage, then something else. Calculation. Fear. A recognition of how catastrophically complicated the truth would be. Margaret had closed her eyes, turned around, and walked back to her own chambers without saying a word, as if by refusing to see she could prevent the reality from existing. As if the rules of the world could be suspended by an act of deliberate ignorance. But the truth has a weight that cannot be ignored forever. And by the time Margaret finally acknowledged what was happening under her roof, it was far too late to prevent the disaster that was coming. The architecture of deception, once 500 words. The Bellmont mansion was designed with a feature common to plantation houses of that era. A network of servants' passages that allowed enslaved people to move through the building while remaining invisible to white family and guests. These narrow corridors ran behind the main rooms, connecting the kitchen to the dining room, the laundry to the bedrooms, the storage areas to the parlors. The architecture itself encoded the ideology of slavery, creating physical spaces that allowed white families to enjoy comfort and service while pretending the human beings who provided it did not exist. Joshua and Rebecca transformed this architecture of subjugation into a geography of freedom. The passages that were designed to make enslaved people invisible became the very spaces where their visibility to each other mattered most. Late at night, when the household slept, and the plantation fell into the temporary quiet that preceded another brutal day of labor, these hidden corridors became their meeting place, a liminal space where the rigid boundaries of Mississippi society temporarily dissolved. They would sit on the narrow stairs between floors, speaking in whispers that carried only to each other. Rebecca would bring books from her father's library, and they would read by candlelight, their heads bent close over pages that discussed ideas dangerous enough to get Joshua killed if anyone discovered him reading them. Abolitionist essays smuggled from the North, philosophical treatises about human equality, poetry that celebrated individual freedom in language that mocked the system holding millions in bondage. Their conversations ranged far beyond what either of them had experienced in their carefully controlled lives. They talked about what freedom actually meant, whether it was a condition of law or a state of mind. They debated whether love could exist authentically in a society built on power imbalances, whether their feelings for each other were genuine or simply artifacts of the bizarre circumstances that had brought them together. They discussed what their lives might look like in a different world, a different time, where the color of Joshua's skin did not determine his legal status as property. Sometimes they did not talk at all. Sometimes they simply sat together in the darkness, Rebecca's hand in Joshua's, finding comfort in a physical intimacy that would have resulted in Joshua's execution if discovered. The touch itself was an act of rebellion, a refusal to accept the rules that insisted their bodies existed in separate categories, one human and one not. The servants' passages also served a practical function in their relationship. When Rebecca needed to communicate with Joshua during daylight hours, when they could not risk being seen together, she would leave notes hidden in specific locations along the passages. Behind a loose brick near the kitchen, under a floorboard by the back stairs, in a gap between the wall and a heavy wardrobe that required 2 people to move. The notes were brief, usually just a time and a place, but their existence created a written record of the relationship that would later become evidence in the investigation that followed. For nearly 2 years, the architecture of the Bellmont mansion protected them. The same physical structure designed to enforce hierarchy and separation became the instrument of its violation. Until the night Rebecca's handwritten note was discovered by a housemaid, and the geography of their deception was finally revealed. The fiction of freedom. The $1 manumission was Joshua's idea, suggested after Rebecca declared her intention to free him properly through legal channels. She had discovered her father's unexecuted manumission documents in late 1839, papers that detailed his plan to free every enslaved person on Bellmont plantation. Rebecca, with the passionate certainty of someone who had not yet learned the limits of good intentions, announced that she would complete her father's work. She would start with Joshua, providing proper financial consideration and full legal documentation that would make his freedom unquestionable. Joshua understood what she did not. He had lived his entire life studying the machinery of oppression, learning how it functioned, where it was rigid, and where it contained unexpected flexibility. A truly freed black man living on a plantation where he had once been enslaved would draw dangerous attention. Questions would be asked about how he obtained his freedom. Investigations would reveal Rebecca's role in the manumission. The relationship between them, still carefully hidden, would be exposed to scrutiny that neither could survive. But AOS, man whose freedom was purchased for an obviously fraudulent sum, yet never questioned, existed in a kind of legal limbo that paradoxically offered more protection. The absurdity of the transaction was itself a shield, because to question it would require white society to acknowledge what everyone already suspected, but no one wanted to examine directly. The $1 manumission was so transparently false that it forced observers to make a choice. Either investigate and expose whatever truth lay behind it, or look away and pretend the irregularity did not exist. Mississippi society chose to look away. The magistrate who processed the paperwork made no comment on the consideration paid. The county clerk who filed the documents asked no questions. The neighboring plantation owners who surely heard about the transaction through the network of gossip that connected all white families said nothing publicly. The conspiracy of silence was not organized or explicit. It emerged organically from a shared understanding that some truths were too dangerous to acknowledge. Joshua's fraudulent freedom gave him a unique position in the social hierarchy. He was legally manumitted so he could not be sold or punished as enslaved people were routinely punished. But his freedom was so obviously illegitimate that no one treated him as actually free. He continued to live at Bellmont Plantation, continued to manage its operations, continued to exist in the ambiguous space between slave and free man that made him simultaneously valuable and vulnerable. The fiction worked because everyone benefited from maintaining it. Margaret benefited from Joshua's skilled management of the plantation without having to acknowledge him as an equal. The white community benefited from not having to confront the implications of what the $1 manumission suggested about Rebecca and Joshua's relationship. And Joshua himself benefited from a form of protection that genuine freedom could never have provided in 1840s Mississippi. But fictions, no matter how carefully maintained, eventually collide with reality. And the reality growing inside Rebecca's body in the winter of 1840 was one that no amount of collective pretending could erase. The $1 manumission had bought them time, but time was running out. The language of flowers, as sepitus tatra, as nuts. In the spring of 1840, Rebecca began keeping a garden that became her method of communication with Joshua. The idea came from a book she had discovered in her father's library, a volume about the Victorian language of flowers, where different blooms carried specific meanings that allowed people to send messages through floral arrangements. Rebecca, who had learned from her relationship with Joshua that survival required creativity, adapted this system for her own purposes. Certain flowers planted in specific arrangements conveyed messages that only Joshua would understand. White roses in the east corner meant, "Tonight at midnight in the usual place." Yellow jasmine climbing the trellis near the kitchen indicated danger, the presence of suspicious visitors or her mother asking uncomfortable questions. Red camellia blooming by the garden gate signaled her monthly courses, the confirmation that no pregnancy had occurred, that they had survived another month without the consequence both of them feared, and, in moments of reckless honesty, secretly desired. The garden became famous throughout the county for its meticulous beauty. Women from neighboring plantations would visit specifically to admire Rebecca's horticultural skills, praising the careful arrangement of colors, the precise timing of blooms, the artistic composition of paths and borders. They would walk through the garden making appreciative comments while remaining completely oblivious to the fact that they were admiring an elaborate code designed to facilitate the most forbidden relationship in Southern society. Rebecca spent hours tending the garden, a perfectly acceptable activity for a young woman of her class. She could be seen on her knees in the dirt, planting and weeding and pruning, engaged in labor that was simultaneously feminine and transgressive. Her mother approved of the garden as a sign that Rebecca was developing proper domestic interests. The neighbors praised it as evidence of refined sensibility. No one suspected that every flower Rebecca planted was a word in a language only Joshua could read. Joshua learned the code quickly, his education allowing him to understand not just the specific meanings Rebecca assigned to different flowers, but the grammar of how they combined to create more complex messages. A white rose next to yellow jasmine meant, "I want to see you, but it is not safe." Red camellia with white rose indicated, "We are safe this month, but I need to speak with you about something important." The garden became a text that they wrote and read together, a collaborative creation that was simultaneously beautiful and dangerous. But the language of flowers had a limitation neither of them fully considered. Gardens do not bloom on command. Rebecca's ability to communicate with Joshua was constrained by growing seasons, by weather, by the unpredictable behavior of living things that did not care about human urgency. In the winter of 1840, when the garden lay dormant and Rebecca desperately needed to tell Joshua something that could not wait for spring blooms, she was forced to take the risk she had been avoiding. She had to speak to him directly, in daylight, where someone might see. That conversation, brief and desperate, and witnessed by 3 housemaids who had been trained their entire lives to be invisible, was when the language of flowers finally failed them. The Complicity of Silence. 4 enslaved women who worked in the Bellmont household knew about Rebecca and Joshua's relationship within weeks of its beginning. Judith, who cleaned the bedrooms, saw the evidence in rumpled sheets that should not have been disturbed, in pillows that carried the indentation of 2 heads instead of 1. Sarah, who did laundry, noticed the grass stains on Rebecca's nightdress that suggested she had been outside in the dark. Mary, who brought breakfast trays, observed the way Rebecca's face flushed when Joshua's name was mentioned. And Ruth, who served at dinner, saw glances between them that lasted too long, that communicated something beyond the formal politeness that should have defined their interactions. These women faced an impossible choice. They could betray the relationship to Margaret Bellmont, earning favor and perhaps small rewards for their vigilance in protecting white social order. The betrayal would almost certainly result in Joshua's execution, Rebecca's disgrace, and the violent reassertion of racial boundaries that their relationship had transgressed. Or they could protect the secret, becoming accomplices to something that violated every rule they lived under, risking brutal punishment if their silence was discovered. They chose silence. Not because they approved of the relationship, though some of them did. Not because they loved Rebecca, though some of them felt a complicated affection for the young woman who had never treated them with her mother's casual cruelty. They chose silence because they understood something that white society refused to acknowledge. That love, even impossible love, was one of the few acts of resistance available to people who owned nothing, not even themselves. Their complicity was not passive. It required active management of information, careful coordination, and constant vigilance. When Margaret asked questions about Rebecca's activities, the four women provided answers that were technically true but strategically incomplete. When guests visited and needed to be kept away from certain parts of the house at certain times, the women created distractions, invented emergencies, orchestrated the complex choreography required to keep secrets in a space where privacy was nearly impossible. Judith began deliberately making noise when she approached Rebecca's room, giving warning of her presence. Sarah learned which linens could be washed without raising questions and which needed to be disposed of more carefully. Mary developed a sense of timing that allowed her to knock on doors at moments when interruption would be least revealing. Ruth positioned herself at dinners where she could watch the door and signal if someone was approaching, who might overhear something dangerous. But their protection carried a cost that none of them had fully anticipated. By choosing to enable Rebecca and Joshua's relationship, they were violating the rules that governed their own survival. The system of slavery depended on enslaved people policing each other, reporting transgressions, maintaining the surveillance that made control possible. The four women's silence was not just protecting Joshua and Rebecca. It was an act of collective resistance that challenged the entire structure of authority on Bellmont Plantation. When the relationship was finally exposed, Margaret Bellmont's rage fell not just on Joshua and Rebecca, but on these four women who had known and said nothing. Their punishment was calculated to send a message to every enslaved person at Bellmont. Silence, the message read, would be treated as the same crime as the action it concealed. Huskare. The economics of desire, Sode. Bellmont Plantation operated at the intersection of two incompatible value systems, and Joshua Fletcher existed precisely at the point where they collided. In the economic logic of slavery, his value could be calculated with brutal precision. A healthy male field hand in his mid-20s, capable of heavy labor, was worth approximately $800. Add literacy and numeracy, and that value increased to perhaps $900. Add the ability to manage complex plantation operations, to keep accounts, to negotiate with cotton factors, and Joshua's market value approached $1,000. He was, by any objective measure, a significant capital asset. But Margaret Bellmont had manumitted him for $1, rendering him simultaneously worthless in the legal record and priceless in actual function. This contradiction allowed him to exist in a social position that should have been impossible. He was neither enslaved nor truly free, neither servant nor equal. He managed Bellmont Plantation's daily operations, gave orders to enslaved workers who technically had the same legal status he did, negotiated contracts that required white business partners to treat him with a courtesy they would never extend to someone still in bondage. Rebecca leveraged this ambiguity deliberately. She paid Joshua a salary that scandalized visitors but positioned him as indispensable to the plantation's profitability. When neighbors questioned Joshua's unusual role, Rebecca would respond with carefully rehearsed answers about efficiency and her father's wishes and the difficulty of finding competent management. She framed Joshua's position in purely economic terms, as if his value to Bellmont could be calculated like cotton yields or equipment depreciation. The language of commerce became a shield against questions about the actual nature of their relationship. The strategy worked because Mississippi plantation society was ultimately more committed to profit than to perfect enforcement of racial hierarchy. If Joshua's management made Bellmont more profitable, if the cotton factors paid higher prices because the accounting was precise, if the slaves worked more efficiently under his supervision, then his anomalous position could be tolerated. Economic success created a space for transgression that principle never could have provided. But this economic logic had a dark corollary. If Joshua was valuable because he was useful, then he was also disposable the moment he ceased to be useful. His protection was purely instrumental, dependent on continued profitability, subject to revision whenever circumstances changed. He understood this with perfect clarity. Every day he remained at Bellmont, every order he gave, every dollar he earned was a negotiation with a system that could destroy him instantly if the calculation of his value ever shifted. The economics of desire created a fragile equilibrium that depended on everyone agreeing not to examine it too closely. Rebecca could love Joshua as long as that love was never acknowledged. Joshua could live in the mansion as long as his presence there was justified by efficiency. The relationship could continue as long as it remained invisible, spoken in codes, hidden in servants' passages, protected by complicit silence. But equilibrium, no matter how carefully maintained, is unstable by definition. It requires constant adjustment, perfect balance, the absence of any shock large enough to disrupt it. And a pregnancy was exactly that kind of shock. Something too large to hide, too real to explain away, too expensive in every sense to be tolerated by the system that had briefly allowed them to exist together. The watchers in the quarters, among the enslaved community at Bellmont Plantation, opinions about Joshua and Rebecca's relationship were sharply divided along lines that revealed the complex internal politics of enslaved people's survival strategies. The division was not simple, not a matter of approval versus disapproval, but rather reflected fundamentally different understandings of what resistance meant and what hope looked like under conditions of absolute oppression. Some viewed Joshua as a traitor who had chosen personal happiness over collective resistance. He slept in the main house while they remained in the quarters. He ate food from the main kitchen while they survived on rations. He wore clothes that marked him as separate from the field workers whose labor actually produced the wealth he helped manage. These critics, led by a man named Isaac, who worked as the plantation's head carpenter, argued that Joshua's relationship with Rebecca was not resistance, but collaboration, that he had allowed himself to be seduced by proximity to whiteness, by comfort, by the illusion of equality that would evaporate the moment it became inconvenient to maintain. Others saw their relationship as a kind of victory, proof that the system could be subverted, that humanity could assert itself even in circumstances designed to destroy it. An elderly woman named Celia, who had been at Bellmont since before Joshua was born, argued that love was itself revolutionary in a world that treated enslaved people as incapable of genuine emotion, that Joshua's refusal to accept the definition of himself as property, his insistence on claiming something the system said he could not have, was exactly the kind of resistance that mattered most. Not the dramatic gesture, but the daily refusal to be what slavery demanded he be. These tensions came to a head in the summer of 1840, when a group of field workers confronted Joshua directly behind the barn where no overseer could witness the conversation. Isaac spoke for the group, his voice low and urgent. "You sleeping in the big house while we're still out here. You think that makes you free? You think Miss Rebecca loves you, or you just convenient for whatever she needs?" The accusation carried the weight of centuries of exploitation, the betrayals that slavery forced upon people who should have been allies. Joshua's response, preserved in testimony given years later by a man who witnessed the confrontation, was simple and devastating. "I have forgotten nothing, but I will not apologize for loving her. You want me to refuse the only thing in my life that feels like choice? You want me to reject the one person who sees me as human? I know what I am. I know this cannot last. I know it will probably kill me. But I will not live like I am already dead just because that is what the system wants from me. The response did not settle the debate. Some continued to view Joshua's choices as selfish, as a betrayal of the collective. Others came to see his relationship with Rebecca as a form of testimony, evidence that enslaved people were capable of everything white society claimed they were not. Capable of love, of intellectual equality, of relationships based on mutual respect rather than coercion. The division within the quarters reflected a larger question that enslaved people faced every day. Was survival the only goal worth pursuing, or was there value in asserting humanity even when doing so carried deadly risk? The neighboring suspicions. By the fall of 1840, 3 neighboring plantations had begun refusing social invitations from Margaret Bellmont. The rejections were not explicit. No one stated directly that they would no longer associate with the Bellmont family. Instead, invitations went unanswered. Planned visits were canceled at the last minute with vague excuses about illness or pressing business. When Margaret attended church services, other families who had once greeted her warmly now offered only the minimum courtesies that civility demanded. The social isolation was deliberate but deniable, a coordinated shunning that operated through silences rather than accusations. Margaret, focused intensely on managing the plantation's business operations, interpreted this social cooling as gender-based prejudice. She believed the neighboring planters were uncomfortable with her independent authority, resentful that a woman was succeeding where they had expected her to fail. The cotton yields at Bellmont had improved under her management. The plantation was more profitable than it had been during her husband's final years. She assumed that her success was threatening to men who believed women incapable of such competence. She told herself that their rejection was a compliment, proof that she had exceeded their expectations and earned their resentment. She never understood that the real source of discomfort was her daughter's relationship with Joshua Fletcher. But everyone else knew. The whispers had been circulating for months through the network of gossip that connected all white plantation families. Servants from different households would meet at markets and church gatherings, sharing information that their owners believed was secret. The white community learned about Rebecca and Joshua not through direct observation, but through the reports of enslaved people who moved between plantations carrying news and rumors that traveled faster than any official communication. The Pritchard family, whose plantation bordered Bellmont to the east, had been the first to withdraw from social contact. Caroline Pritchard had heard from her lady's maid about a conversation between Rebecca and Joshua that had been overheard through an open window. The content was not explicitly romantic, but the tone was intimate in a way that violated every boundary Mississippi society was built upon. Caroline had shared this information with her husband, who had shared it with other planters during their regular gatherings at the county courthouse. Within 2 weeks, the entire white community knew that something improper was happening at Bellmont Plantation. But knowledge and action are not the same thing. To act on what they knew would require the white community to acknowledge publicly what they were carefully pretending not to notice. It would require investigation, testimony, legal proceedings that would expose the details of what Rebecca and Joshua had been doing. Such exposure would be scandalous not just for the Bellmont family, but for the entire social order. It would force everyone to confront questions they did not want to answer about how such a relationship had been allowed to develop, about what it said about the system of control they all participated in, so they chose a middle path. Social isolation without explanation, punishment without confrontation, a coordinated shunning that communicated disapproval while avoiding the messy business of actually doing anything about the source of that disapproval. This conspiracy of whispers created an isolation around Bellmont Plantation that would prove catastrophic when crisis finally arrived. Because when Rebecca needed allies, when she needed intervention from people with power, there was no one left who would help her. The community had already decided she was beyond redemption, months before the pregnancy made her transgression impossible to ignore. The Christmas Revelation. December 25, 1840, marked the last Christmas that the Bellmont household would celebrate with any semblance of normalcy. The day had begun with the rituals that defined plantation holiday observances. Margaret had distributed small gifts to the enslaved workers, a calculated performance of benevolence designed to reinforce hierarchy through the appearance of generosity. The house servants had prepared an elaborate meal, dishes that required days of preparation and reflected the wealth that cotton had brought to families like the Bellmonts. Everything proceeded according to the script that governed such occasions, maintaining the fiction that master and slave existed in a relationship of mutual obligation rather than violent coercion. Rebecca, now 19 years old, had been quiet throughout the morning. She picked at her food during the midday meal, her face pale in a way that Margaret attributed to one of the mysterious female complaints that supposedly afflicted young women of delicate constitution. But when the table had been cleared and Margaret had settled into the parlor with her correspondence, Rebecca followed her mother into the room and closed the door behind her. The gesture itself was unusual enough to make Margaret look up from her letters with an expression of mild irritation. Rebecca made her announcement standing near the window, backlit by winter sunlight that gave her an almost ethereal quality. She spoke with a calm that suggested she had rehearsed the words many times, testing different phrasings until she found the ones that felt true. "Mother, I am with child. The father is Joshua Fletcher, and I will not apologize for loving him." The words were simple, declarative, stripped of the elaborate justifications or emotional appeals that might have softened their impact. They were a statement of fact, delivered with the confidence of someone who had already accepted all possible consequences. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 15 seconds, but witnesses who had been standing in the hallway outside the parlor would later describe it as endless. A pause during which the entire architecture of their lives collapsed and reformed into something unrecognizable. Through the door, the housemaid Judith could hear nothing, no sound of movement or speech, only a silence so complete it seemed to absorb all other noise in the house. She would later testify that she had pressed her ear against the wood, terrified that one of them had died, that the silence indicated violence rather than mere shock. Margaret's face went through a series of transformations that Rebecca watched with a strange detachment. Shock first, the woman's carefully maintained composure cracking to reveal something raw beneath. Then rage, a flash of anger so intense that Rebecca instinctively stepped backward, her body recognizing danger even as her mind remained committed to the path she had chosen. But the rage did not sustain itself. It transformed into something else, something that frightened Rebecca more than anger ever could. Calculation. A cold assessment that moved across Margaret's features like winter settling over a landscape. When Margaret finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost conversational. "How far along?" Rebecca told her. 4 months. Far enough that termination would be dangerous. Far enough that the pregnancy would soon become visible, no matter how loose the clothing. Margaret nodded slowly, as if Rebecca had confirmed something she had already suspected. Then she said the words that would haunt Rebecca for the rest of her life. "I see. Then we have decisions to make." The Offer of Exile. Margaret Bellmont's first response to her daughter's pregnancy was not violence, but negotiation. She spent the night after Rebecca's announcement alone in her study, reviewing account books and legal documents with the same methodical attention she brought to all problems that required solutions. By morning, she had developed a plan that was, by the standards of 1841 Mississippi, extraordinarily generous. She presented it to Rebecca over breakfast, speaking in the calm tones of someone discussing business arrangements rather than her daughter's future. The proposal was elegant in its simplicity. Rebecca would disappear to Europe under the pretense of completing her education in Paris or London. Young women of wealthy families often spent a year or two abroad refining their accomplishments, learning languages, acquiring the cultural polish that would make them more attractive marriage prospects. No one would question the timing. Rebecca would have the child in France or England, somewhere far from Mississippi's social networks and prying questions. The baby would be given to a Catholic orphanage, or perhaps adopted by a respectable family, who would raise it without knowledge of its parentage. After a year, Rebecca would return to Mississippi with her reputation intact. She would be presented to society as an educated, sophisticated young woman who had benefited from European travel. Suitable marriage prospects would be arranged. The entire episode would be erased, forgotten, buried under layers of careful deception that would protect both Rebecca and the Bellmont family name. As for Joshua, Margaret's plan was equally straightforward. He would be given genuine freedom papers, properly executed with full legal consideration. No more $1 fraudulent transactions. He would receive money, $500, enough to establish himself in Philadelphia or New York or Boston. He would leave Mississippi immediately, before the pregnancy became visible, and he would never contact Rebecca again. He would be free, truly free, with the resources to build whatever life he chose in the North, where racial barriers, while still present, were at least less absolute than in the slave South. The two of them would never see each other again. That was the essential condition, the price Margaret demanded for her mercy. Complete separation, permanent exile from each other's lives. But both would survive with their lives intact and a measure of dignity preserved. Joshua would live as a free man. Rebecca would eventually marry and have legitimate children whose parentage would never be questioned. The forbidden child would be raised by strangers who would love it without knowing the dangerous circumstances of its conception. Margaret presented this plan as if it were obviously the correct solution, the only rational response to an impossible situation. She seemed genuinely surprised when Rebecca's response came immediately, without hesitation, without any apparent consideration of the generous alternatives being offered. "No," Rebecca said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "I will not give away Joshua's child. I will not pretend this love was shameful. If we must die for it, then we die. But I will not live the lie you are asking for." Margaret stared at her daughter for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted from negotiation to warfare. The offer had been refused. What came next would not be mercy. The legal impossibility was 500 words. What neither Rebecca nor Joshua fully understood was the legal machinery that made their situation inescapable. They had been focused on the social dimensions of their transgression, the scandal and shame that discovery would bring. But the law created constraints far more absolute than social disapproval. Mississippi law in 1841 prohibited marriage between white and black individuals under penalty of imprisonment for both parties and any official who performed such a ceremony. The statute was explicit, designed to prevent exactly the kind of relationship Rebecca and Joshua had formed. But the legal impossibility went deeper than just marriage prohibition. Any child born of a union between a white woman and a black man existed in a category that the law had specifically defined. Such a child was legally classified as a slave, regardless of the mother's free status. The normal rule that children inherited the legal status of their mother, free or enslaved, was reversed in cases of miscegenation. The child Rebecca carried would be born into slavery, property of the Bellmont estate, subject to sale or transfer like any other asset. The law had anticipated the possibility of white women bearing children by black men, and had created a framework to ensure such children could never threaten the racial hierarchy. Even if Rebecca succeeded in fleeing north with Joshua and the child, even if they reached a free state where slavery was illegal, the legal jeopardy would follow them. Any state that recognized slavery under the Fugitive Slave Act could theoretically return the child as stolen property. Bounty hunters who specialized in recovering escaped slaves could pursue them across state lines with legal sanction. The child would spend its entire life vulnerable to capture and return to Mississippi, to slavery, to separation from its parents. Margaret Bellmont understood these legal realities in ways her daughter did not. She consulted with a lawyer in Natchez, a man named Harrison Wickfield, who specialized in plantation law and who could be trusted to maintain confidentiality about sensitive family matters. Judge Wickfield, as he preferred to be called despite never having actually served on the bench, reviewed the situation with the dispassionate analysis that made him valuable to clients facing complicated problems. His assessment, delivered in Margaret's parlor over brandy and cigars, was brutal in its clarity. Your daughter has created a child that cannot legally exist as free. Her love has produced an impossibility. The child will be born a slave, property of your estate. You could manumit the child, but doing so would require public acknowledgement of its parentage and the circumstances of its conception. Such acknowledgement would destroy your daughter's reputation and likely result in criminal charges against Fletcher for relations with a white woman. Alternatively, you could dispose of the child quietly after birth, report it as stillborn, and no one would investigate too closely. The law provides no other options. Margaret had listened to this analysis without visible emotion, her face a mask of the self-control she had perfected during her years managing the plantation. When Judge Wickfield finished speaking, she asked a single question. And if the child simply disappeared? If it was never recorded in any official document, never acknowledged as existing at all? The judge had smiled slightly, understanding the direction of her thinking. Then legally, it never existed. And what never existed cannot be a crime to dispose of. The conspiracy forms, 500 word. In January of 1841, Margaret Bellmont hosted a private dinner for three powerful figures whose cooperation would be essential for what she had begun planning. Judge Harrison Wickfield, who had already advised her on the legal dimensions of Rebecca's situation. Dr. Samuel Pemberton, the plantation physician whose discretion had been proven through years of treating conditions that families preferred to keep private. And Reverend Marcus Ashford, whose authority could provide religious sanction for decisions that might otherwise seem cruel. No written record was kept of what was discussed that evening. The servants who prepared and served the meal were sent away before the serious conversation began. The four of them sat in Margaret's study until nearly midnight, their voices occasionally rising to audible levels that suggested disagreement, negotiation, the working out of details that required careful coordination. When the three men finally departed, each carried documents that Margaret had prepared in advance, papers that awaited only their signatures to become legally binding. Within a week, the first of these documents appeared in the county records, legal papers that designated Margaret as sole guardian of any issue resulting from unfortunate circumstances involving her daughter. The language was deliberately vague, but its meaning was clear to anyone who understood the context. Rebecca's parental rights to any child she bore were being legally transferred to her mother before the child was even born. The document was signed by Judge Wickfield in his capacity as a county magistrate, giving it the force of law despite the obvious irregularity of preemptive guardianship assignment. Dr. Pemberton began making preparations for what he euphemistically called a delicate medical procedure to be performed at Bellmont Plantation, rather than in town where it might attract attention. He ordered supplies that suggested he was preparing for a difficult birth, quantities of laudanum and chloroform that exceeded what normal deliveries required. He also began making inquiries quietly and indirectly about families in New Orleans who might be willing to adopt a child of mixed race, no questions asked. These inquiries were conducted through intermediaries, maintaining enough distance that Pemberton could deny direct involvement if anyone later investigated. Reverend Ashford's role was perhaps the most insidious. He began circulating a story about Rebecca's declining mental health, her unfortunate delusions, and the family's heartbreaking decision to seek institutional care for her nervous condition. He spoke of this tragedy in confidential tones to influential parishioners, framing it as a pastoral concern that required prayer and discretion. The story spread through the community with the speed that only religious gossip achieves, creating a narrative foundation that would later justify whatever actions Margaret decided to take. If Rebecca needed to be institutionalized, if she disappeared from public view for extended periods, if her testimony about events became unreliable, the groundwork had already been laid to explain why her words should not be trusted. The conspiracy was elegant in its simplicity. Rebecca would be declared mentally incompetent, stripped of her legal rights over her own child and her own body. The child would be delivered under conditions that allowed for maximum control over its fate, and Joshua would be eliminated through legal mechanisms that would appear entirely justified under Mississippi law. 3 powerful men had agreed to participate in this machinery of destruction, not because they were unusually cruel, but because they saw it as necessary maintenance of the social order they all benefited from. A white woman who loved a black man was not a tragedy to be pitied. She was a threat to be neutralized. The flight attempt. On February 12, 1841, Joshua and Rebecca attempted to flee Bellmont Plantation, under cover of darkness, carrying everything they owned in 2 small bags that would not slow their movement. The plan was simple because complex plans were too vulnerable to the 1,000 variables they could not control. They would walk the 12 miles to the Mississippi River, following paths that avoided the main roads where patrols might stop them. At the river, they would find passage on a steamboat heading north, using forged travel documents that identified Rebecca as a widow traveling with her servant. Once they reached Illinois or Ohio, they would disappear into communities that might offer protection to fugitives willing to work hard and ask few questions. They made it 7 miles before being intercepted by a patrol that had been specifically watching for them. The riders appeared suddenly on the path ahead, blocking their escape with a coordination that suggested they knew exactly where Joshua and Rebecca would be and when. The leader of the patrol was a man named Thomas Garrett, an overseer from a neighboring plantation who supplemented his income by catching escaped slaves and collecting the bounties their owners offered for their return. Garrett addressed Rebecca with elaborate courtesy that barely concealed his contempt. "Miss Bellmont, your mother has been worried sick about you. She asked us to help bring you home safely." He did not look at Joshua while speaking, treating him as if he did not exist, as if Rebecca was alone on the dark path and the man standing beside her was simply invisible. The deliberate erasure was its own form of violence, a reminder that in the eyes of white Mississippi, Joshua was not a person but a problem to be solved. When the patrol moved to separate them, Joshua fought. He had known this moment would come, had prepared himself mentally for the choice between submission and resistance. He chose resistance, not because he believed he could win, but because surrender felt like betraying everything he and Rebecca had tried to claim for themselves. He injured 2 men before being beaten unconscious, his blood soaking into the Mississippi dirt while Rebecca screamed his name over and over until her voice broke. Rebecca, 5 months pregnant and restrained by hands that were simultaneously careful not to harm the white woman and utterly indifferent to her anguish, was dragged back toward Bellmont Plantation. She fought too, with a ferocity that surprised the men holding her. But pregnancy had weakened her, and they were experienced at controlling people who did not want to be controlled. Joshua was thrown across the back of a horse, still unconscious, and taken in the opposite direction toward the county jail on charges of assault and attempted abduction of a white woman. Their last words to each other, shouted across increasing distance as they were pulled apart, were simply, "I love you," repeated until neither could hear the other anymore. The words carried into the darkness, meaningless to the men who witnessed them, everything to the two people being separated. Years later, one of the patrol members would confess during a moment of drunken guilt that he had never forgotten those voices calling to each other across the growing distance, that the sound had haunted him because it revealed something he had spent his entire life denying, that enslaved people loved exactly the way white people did, that the system he enforced was destroying something as real and valuable as anything he had ever protected. The Vigil of the Condemned. Joshua Fletcher spent 31 days in the county jail, awaiting a trial that everyone knew would end in execution. The cell was small, barely 6 feet by 8, with a narrow window near the ceiling that allowed in enough light to mark the passage of days, but not enough to read by. The conditions were deliberately harsh, designed to break the spirit of anyone held there, to ensure that when prisoners finally faced judgment, they were already defeated by isolation and despair. But Joshua was not alone in the way the jail was designed to make prisoners alone. 3 enslaved men who had worked alongside him at Bellmont plantation risked their lives to maintain contact with him during those 31 days. They bribed the jail's cook, a free black woman named Hannah, who supplemented her meager wages by carrying messages between prisoners and the outside world. Through Hannah, they smuggled food that was better than the prison rations, clean clothes, writing materials, and most importantly, news about Rebecca. The news was devastating. Rebecca had been locked in her room at Bellmont plantation, guarded constantly, allowed no visitors and no communication with anyone outside the house. Margaret had announced that her daughter was suffering from a nervous disorder, brought on by the trauma of being abducted by a deranged slave. Dr. Pemberton was attending her regularly, administering sedatives that kept her in a fog of semi-consciousness. The pregnancy was progressing despite these interventions, the child continuing to grow even as everything around it collapsed into violence. Joshua used his time in jail to write. He filled page after page with testimony about his life, documenting his education, his relationship with Rebecca, his understanding that his death was inevitable, but his refusal to accept that what they had done was wrong. The writing was clear and eloquent, revealing an intelligence that contradicted every assumption white Mississippi made about enslaved people's intellectual capacity. He wrote about the philosophy he had studied with Colonel Bellmont, about the poetry he and Rebecca had read together, about the impossibility of the love they had found, and the inevitability of its destruction. He also wrote practical instructions for the 3 men who were risking themselves to maintain contact with him. He told them where he had hidden money at Bellmont plantation, small amounts saved over years that might help them if they ever attempted escape. He wrote the names of abolitionists in Philadelphia who might help fugitives seeking freedom. He documented Margaret Bellmont's various crimes and frauds, creating evidence that might someday be used against her if circumstances ever allowed for justice rather than revenge. His final entry, written the night before his execution on March 13th, was brief. "I regret nothing. Love was worth this. If there is a next world, I will find her there. If there is only darkness, then I go to it at having known something real. Tell Rebecca that she made me more than what this system said I could be. Tell her the child, if it lives, carries the best of both of us. Tell her to survive." The guards found the writings when they came to collect Joshua for his execution. They burned most of the pages immediately, understanding instinctively that such documents were dangerous. But Hannah had already smuggled copies out of the jail, hidden in her clothing, preserved against the day when someone might care about the testimony of a man Mississippi had decided to kill. The child that could not be. Rebecca gave birth on March the 7th, 1841, in a locked room in the Bellmont mansion with only Dr. Pemberton and Margaret present. No midwife was called despite the traditional role enslaved women played in plantation births. No servants were allowed near the room. The isolation was deliberate, designed to ensure that what happened during and after the birth would be witnessed only by people whose loyalty to Margaret was absolute. The labor was long and difficult. Rebecca, weakened by months of inadequate food and the sedatives Dr. Pemberton had been administering, struggled to deliver a child whose size suggested it had somehow thrived despite the hostile conditions of its gestation. She screamed for Joshua, not knowing he had been executed 6 days earlier, calling his name between contractions as if love could reach across death and bring him back to witness the birth of their son. The child was born just after midnight. A boy, healthy despite everything that should have killed him, crying with the lusty indignation of new life encountering a world it had not agreed to enter. Dr. Pemberton cleaned the infant with the mechanical efficiency of someone performing a task rather than witnessing a miracle. Margaret watched from the corner of the room, her face unreadable, calculating something that Rebecca was too exhausted to interpret. What happened in the hours immediately following the birth remains the darkest mystery of the entire story. The official record states that the child was stillborn, that despite Dr. Pemberton's best efforts, the infant never drew breath. This declaration was recorded in the county registry, signed by Dr. Pemberton as the attending physician, countersigned by Margaret as the head of household. The fiction became truth through documentation, the kind of alchemy that law performs when it serves power, rather than justice. But 3 different sources later claim to have seen Margaret leaving the plantation that night, around 3 in the morning, carrying a bundle wrapped in blankets. She was alone, driving a small carriage herself, rather than requiring a driver whose presence would create a witness. She traveled toward the Mississippi River, following roads that were nearly empty at that hour. One account comes from a night fisherman who saw her at the river's edge, standing alone with the bundle, staring at the dark water for what seemed like hours. Another source suggests the child was given to a free black family living in New Orleans, smuggled out of Mississippi before any record of his existence could be created. A midwife in New Orleans later reported delivering a light-skinned infant to a family who paid in cash and asked no questions about the baby's origins. The timing matched, the description was consistent, but proof was impossible to establish. A third possibility, whispered but never proven, was that Margaret had simply done what plantation owners had done to inconvenient children for generations. That the river had received the child, that his brief life had ended in dark water, that he had been erased as completely as if he had never existed. This version was the one that haunted Rebecca most, the possibility that tortured her during the years she spent institutionalized and searching afterward. The only certainty is that by morning, when Rebecca woke from the drugged sleep Dr. Pemberton had induced, the child was gone. And her screams, when she realized what had been taken from her, could be heard throughout the mansion and into the quarters beyond. The execution. Joshua Fletcher was hanged on March 14, 1841, in the public square of Natchez, before a crowd of approximately 300 spectators who had gathered to witness what local newspapers called the just punishment of a dangerous criminal who had forgotten his place. The execution was scheduled for noon, a timing designed to ensure maximum attendance, turning death into public spectacle and moral instruction. By the standards of the era, Joshua's execution was notable for 2 unprecedented occurrences that would be discussed in whispers for years afterward. First, he was allowed to speak from the gallows. The custom in Mississippi executions was for condemned men to be offered the opportunity to confess their sins and beg forgiveness from God and the community they had wronged. Most used this moment to perform the submission that might at least protect their families from retribution, to play the role of the repentant sinner who acknowledged the justice of his punishment. Joshua used his final moments differently. He spoke for nearly 10 minutes, his voice carrying across the square with the clarity of someone who had been trained to read aloud, who understood how to project and emphasize, who could command attention through language itself. He spoke about the humanity of enslaved people, about the capacity for love and thought and feeling, that white society spent enormous energy denying. He quoted Shakespeare and Wordsworth, demonstrating the education that Colonel Bellmont had given him, proving through his own eloquence that everything Mississippi believed about racial intellectual inferiority was a lie built to justify atrocity. He spoke about Rebecca, not with the shame that the crowd expected, but with a tenderness that several witnesses later admitted had moved them to tears despite their determination to remain unmoved. He said her name as if it were sacred. He described their love as the one real thing in his life, the one choice he had made that belonged entirely to him. He said he would die grateful for having known what it meant to be seen as human by another person, to be loved, not despite what he was, but because of who he was. The second unprecedented occurrence was the presence of approximately 40 enslaved people who had gathered to watch. They stood separate from the white crowd on the opposite side of the square, silent and unmoving. Their presence was itself a form of testimony, a collective witness that transformed the execution from punishment into martyrdom. Local authorities considered ordering them to disperse, but ultimately decided that preventing their attendance might trigger the violence that everyone feared but no one wanted to acknowledge was possible. When Joshua's body was cut down after the hanging, when the white crowd had dispersed, satisfied that justice had been served, those 40 enslaved witnesses followed at a distance as the body was taken to be buried in an unmarked grave at the edge of the county cemetery. They stayed throughout the night, mounting a vigil that combined African traditions with Christian prayers, marking the grave with stones and flowers that would be removed by morning, but that served their purpose in the darkness. The vigil was never reported in newspapers. No official record acknowledged it occurred, but the enslaved community across 3 counties knew that Joshua Fletcher had died without submission, that his final words had been defiance disguised as philosophy, and that 40 witnesses had refused to let him go into the ground, alone and forgotten. The living death of Rebecca Bellmont. After losing both Joshua and her child in the space of 7 days, Rebecca Bellmont descended into a grief so profound that it resembled madness, though whether she was truly insane or simply broken by trauma became a question that doctors and family members debated without ever reaching consensus. She stopped speaking for the first 3 weeks, sitting motionless in her locked room, staring at walls that offered no answers to questions she could no longer articulate. When she finally began talking again, her words were fragmented, looping between past and present, between memory and hallucination in ways that terrified the servants assigned to watch her. Margaret Bellmont used her daughter's condition as justification for the decision she had already made. In May of 1841, Rebecca was committed to a private asylum in Tennessee, a facility that catered to wealthy Southern families who needed to institutionalize relatives whose behavior threatened family reputations. The institution was called Willowbrook, a name designed to evoke pastoral serenity rather than the reality of locked wards and forced treatments that defined life inside its walls. Rebecca would remain at Willowbrook for the next 17 years. The commitment papers described her as suffering from moral insanity brought on by inappropriate attachments and nervous hysteria. The diagnosis was broad enough to justify indefinite institutionalization, vague enough to avoid specifying exactly what Rebecca had done to warrant confinement. Margaret visited twice in the first year, then never returned, sending money monthly to cover Rebecca's care, but otherwise severing contact with the daughter who had destroyed the family's reputation. During those 17 years, Rebecca wrote hundreds of letters. She wrote to Joshua, not knowing he was dead, describing her daily life in the asylum and begging him to find her. She wrote to Margaret, alternating between pleading for release and denouncing her mother's cruelty with language so vivid that asylum staff confiscated most of these letters before they could be mailed. She wrote to the child she had lost, imagining him growing up somewhere, telling him stories about his father, promising that someday she would find him. Few of these letters were ever mailed, but those that survived reveal a mind not insane, but trapped. Rebecca understood perfectly well what had been done to her. She knew that Joshua had been executed, though no one had officially told her. She knew that her child had been taken, though the asylum staff insisted she had hallucinated the pregnancy entirely. She knew that her mother had orchestrated everything, and she refused to pretend otherwise even when submission might have earned her earlier release. The asylum's treatment protocols included water therapy, restraints during periods of excitement, and large doses of laudanum that kept patients in a constant fog of semi-consciousness. Rebecca endured these treatments with a stubborn resistance that frustrated her doctors. They noted in their records that she was uncooperative, that she refused to acknowledge her delusions even when confronted with the impossibility of her claims, that she persisted in her false narrative despite all evidence to the contrary. What the doctors interpreted as madness was actually integrity. Rebecca would not accept the version of reality that her confinement demanded she accept. She would not agree that her love for Joshua had been a symptom of illness, rather than a genuine human connection. She would not pretend that the child she had carried had never existed. Her sanity depended on maintaining the truth even when everyone around her insisted it was lies. Margaret Bellmont died in 1858, and with her death the monthly payments sustaining Rebecca's institutionalization ceased. Willowbrook released her after 17 years, not because she was cured, but because no one was paying to keep her locked up anymore. The Hidden Heir. The final mystery of Joshua Fletcher and Rebecca Bellmont's story concerns the fate of their child, a question that consumed Rebecca's later years and remains unresolved to this day. When Rebecca was finally released from Willowbrook in 1858, she returned to Bellmont Plantation to discover that she had inherited everything. Margaret had died without updating her will, and despite her best efforts to disinherit her daughter through moral condemnation, the law recognized Rebecca as the sole heir. Rebecca sold most of the plantation immediately, keeping only the main house and a small parcel of land. She used the money to fund an obsessive search for her son, following every rumor and hint and possibility across the South. She traveled to New Orleans dozens of times, investigating reports of light-skinned children who had appeared in free black families around the time of her son's birth. She visited Catholic orphanages, Baptist missions, private adoption agencies, anywhere that might have records of a child matching the description she carried in her mind. In 1872, after 14 years of searching, a man named Thomas Freeman appeared in Natchez claiming to be the lost child of Bellmont Plantation. He was approximately 31 years old, of mixed race, with features that could plausibly have come from either Rebecca or Joshua. He carried documents suggesting he had been raised by a free black family in New Orleans named Freeman, that he had always known he was adopted, that he had spent years searching for information about his birth parents. The story he told was consistent with one version of events. He claimed that Margaret Bellmont had paid his adoptive family to take him, that they had been given money and documents and a single instruction: raise the child far from Mississippi and never reveal his origins. But the Freeman family had kept records, had preserved letters and receipts that suggested the story might be true. Thomas had come forward after Margaret's death made it safe to do so, hoping to find his mother and learn the truth about his father. Rebecca met with Thomas 3 times. The meetings took place in her parlor at Bellmont, with a lawyer present to document everything said. Rebecca was desperate to believe, searching Thomas's face for traces of Joshua, for evidence that some fragment of their love had survived. She asked him questions about his childhood, his memories, his feelings about the story he had been told. Thomas answered patiently, understanding what was at stake, but unable to provide the definitive proof that would settle the question beyond doubt. The meetings ended inconclusively. Thomas Freeman could not prove he was Rebecca's son. The documents he carried were suggestive, but not definitive. The physical resemblance was plausible, but not compelling. And Rebecca could not bear the possibility of claiming a false heir, only to lose him again when the truth emerged. They parted with a promise to continue searching for evidence. But Rebecca died 6 months later, in February 1873, carrying the uncertainty to her grave. Whether Thomas Freeman was genuinely her son, or simply another person destroyed by slavery's legacy of separation and loss, remains an open question. One final cruelty in a story built from cruelties. One more child who might have been, in a history full of children who could not be allowed to exist.